So I will hand over to Claire at this point. Thank you again for joining. Claire is an environmental management expert with over 20 years experience. And Claire is joining us from Julie's Bicycle, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, an organisation with a huge amount of experience supporting organisations on their net zero journey. So over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thank you for inviting me today. I know from what Suzanne has been telling me, you're doing lots of great work already, and collaboration is absolutely key. So I'm going to talk about the net zero journey, which involves many different elements. But I will just start with a brief intro to Julie's Bicycle and also a little bit of the work which we do, which is more connected to the heritage sector. So we started 15 years ago. We're a non-profit organisation, and we came from the music sector, but we work on climate action and environmental action now internationally, and across the international creative and cultural community. So from theatre to museums and galleries to music in all kinds of shapes and forms. We have three main objectives to support culture to become net zero carbon and to restore nature, to inspire public action on climate and ecology, because that is, what the sector is best at, and to champion environmental justice and fairness, which is absolutely crucial, because the reason we are in the situation we are in today is because of inequality and injustice and a culture of extractivism. We work across three main areas. We work around with individual organisations on organisational change and action. We work on sector level, on sector transition, and we also do a lot of work around policy and advocacy. We have a few key programs. Our Creative Green program is how we work with individual organisations, and that's mainly our consultancy program. We also have a Creative Climate Leadership program, which we've done now in 4 different countries. Well, we did a European one, a US one, we're doing a Canadian one and a Scandinavian one, and watch this space, but hopefully a UK one coming soon. We do a lot of work on climate justice, and most recently this year launched a new Creative Climate Justice Hub. We are a delivery partner for Arts Council England for their environmental programme, and we've been doing that for 10 years. It's given us a lot of great insights and learnings. We also work in the policy and advocacy areas. Some of the key programs we have are around place-based approaches in cities. And last year, most recently, we did a big piece on cultural policy and its role in climate action, which was part of a British Council programme called The Climate Connection. Just a few examples of the organisations we've worked with, which I think will be more relevant to yourselves. So we've worked with the Black Country Living Museum and Ironbridge Gorge, 2 organisations which would absolutely claim their place in being related to the birth of the Industrial Revolution and the birth of climate change, human-caused climate change. We've also worked with lots of museums and galleries, and we've also done some work with English Heritage. In terms of our partnerships, just a few to mention. We're involved with the Climate Heritage Network, which I'm sure you all know of. We also are just starting work with the National Rural Touring Forum to look at the impacts of rural touring, which is a really tricky issue. And we work a lot with the music sector, and we're also involved in a partnership with the Green Libraries programme. So that's just a flavour of who we work with and who our partners are. Some of the resources which we've been able to develop through the Arts Council environmental program supports. Some examples here of a more recent guidance around problem plastics, around nature, and around creative climate justice. For museums and heritage, we just, I think, late last year brought out some top tips, which is some simple information, links, and guidance for museums and heritage sector. And one project also to mention, we've been involved in a Horizon 2020 project up to the point where we were still able to do that as a member of the European Union. And this was the ROC project, which was about cultural heritage and urban regeneration. That was a massive project. We had a relatively modest role in, but there's some nice resources there, and the Green Heritage Futures podcast you might be interested in particular, with some interesting speakers, including Catherine Leonard of the International National Trusts Organisation. So that is a whistle-stop tour of Julie's bicycle. You've asked me to talk about net zero today. I think last week in particular has focused everybody's minds. It's here, it's now, it's happening. But just to say, so this is where we are. We've already, since the pre-industrial age, seen a temperature rise of 1.2 degrees Celsius, and the consequences which this is having. We have a number of different pathways and options to keep to 1.5 degrees warming, but the policies that we are on at the moment, it's looking more like about a 3 degrees warming. Doesn't sound like much, but as you can see, where 1.2 degrees temperature rise has already brought us. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change brought out 3 reports which made up its most recent 6th assessments. It lays the blame squarely on humanity and human-caused climate change. It says that we see the impacts of this global temperature rise across the world in different ways, from heat waves and floods to rising sea levels. And most recently, the 3rd report in the 6th assessment, that this goal of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees is all but lost, and we are falling far behind on making the changes we need to limit the worst consequences. And this is despite the fact that we know what we need to do and we have the solutions. I can't really talk about net zero without talking about nature, because the two are deeply, deeply intertwined. This quote from Patrick Vallance, I think, puts it perfectly, that climate change leads to biodiversity loss, which in turn leads to further climate change, and that you can't solve one without the other. You may have heard of the IPBES. Doesn't exactly trip off the tongue, but that's so similar to the IPCC. It's the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They brought out a couple of reports over the last 2 weeks, but essentially we know that we are experiencing deep loss and damage to our natural systems and habitats, and that we have to address this issue at the same time as addressing climate change. And the other thing, which I also can't speak about climate change and net zero without mentioning, is justice. The richest people in the world, the richest 10% of the global population, were responsible for just over half of global emissions. And the world's richest 1% cause double the emissions of the poorest. We are the most responsible, and we have the biggest responsibility to do something about it. And what happens next needs to be inclusive and needs to provide for a green and just transition. So, in terms of net zero, I think this definition from the government's net zero strategy puts it quite clearly. And it's basically saying that by the middle of this century, so by 2050, we have to reduce emissions to as close to zero as possible. And the small remaining amount of emissions need to be absorbed through things such as natural carbon sinks, nature, and new technologies. So basically what we know is we have to make the biggest, deepest cuts as soon as possible. Most organizations looking at a 50%, most organizations who have a decent commitment are looking towards a 50% reduction by 2030, and then looking towards a longer term net zero ambition by 2050. So we talk a lot about net zero, sorry, I'm going to go back, and this idea of measuring and reducing our scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. I think it's also really important to say, and especially for heritage organizations, for the cultural and creative community, when we use net zero, this term, it very often tends to be a proxy for simply being the best we can environmentally. It means using less energy, using low or zero carbon energy, moving from a model which is taking, making and disposing to a circular model which designs out waste and pollution. I'm not going to go through the list, but it really is that, you know, what can we do to be the best we can environmentally? And net zero has definitely become a proxy for that. And it's not always easy for heritage organizations, cultural organizations to do that very scientific scope 1, 2 and 3 measurements. And I think this is equally valid. It's really hard to put the metrics are important. Measuring your emissions is really important, but this goes beyond so much more than the numbers. So if you think of those kind of two approaches, the very formal approach of measuring your scopes and setting your targets and reducing them, to that broader approach, just two examples that I wanted to show. One is from Blenheim Palace, which has done amazing work. And if you haven't seen it, I would definitely recommend their green reports. It lays out very clearly their carbon footprints, what the key areas are, and then it also goes into those areas of impact which have a smaller part of the carbon footprint, which they are nonetheless addressing. And I'll just go to the next one. And it also lays out their commitments and their actions to not only reducing that carbon footprint of 32,000 tonnes, but also to remove 230,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent from the atmosphere. And it lays out some nice and important initiatives which are also very much linked to nature and regeneration. And another very different approach from the Horniman Museum of Gardens, which is based in South East London. And they've done amazing work, and they laid out their climate and ecology manifesto in January 2020. It does include, as they put it, an ambition to be greenhouse gas neutral by 2040, but it is very much focused on nature and ecology, and it has a wide range of really wonderful engagement initiatives, such as their Environmental Champions Club. And most recent, one of their lovely recent projects, they're planting a microforest close to the gardens, which is very much also a community engagement project, and very much about dealing with the noise and air pollution, which is a massive, massive issue in their location in South East London. So that's just to give a sense of two different approaches to net zero. When we're working with individual organizations, we work to our Creative Green Framework for Change, and that's about understanding this is really important and is the first step to action. Then commitment, and then improvement and taking action to reduce impact, but also to take positive action. We've worked with hundreds of organizations under this framework, What does good look like in terms of understanding? It's when you've got comprehensive, consistent impact reporting over time, and that you are clear on the scope of that information is transparent and publicly available. And really, I think important to say, understanding is absolutely about the carbon numbers and the emissions, but there's lots of other things that you can look at, and also qualitative information is really important. And then also crucially, using that information to inform action. That's when you know it's really good. In terms of commitment, what good looks like is having clear ambition, objectives and targets, and a plan on how to achieve this. Having dedicated environmental roles and responsibilities, and absolutely crucial to have senior leadership on this. Having internal skills, capacity building and engagement, and external engagement and collaboration and advocacy. In terms of improvements, a lot of organizations start focusing on the operational side, but absolutely crucial is to look at the core of what an organization does, and to apply a green lens to key decisions, decision making and planning. Something that we always look at with organizations is this question of control and influence. What are those things you can't directly control? Where can you have influence? And then there will be some areas, for example, public transport infrastructure, which you cannot control, but that are of great concern to you as an organization. So this is a really nice way of addressing things, because especially when you start, it can be quite overwhelming. So, you know, where can you have the biggest impact, and then move out from there. In terms of the approach, a best practice hierarchy is measurement and understanding, then see what you can do to avoid emissions in the first place, then look at reducing, and this can be through things like energy efficiency. Replace is then kind of much more towards the bottom of this hierarchy, which is about replacing the high carbon fossil fuel energy sources with the lower carbon energy sources. A lot of organizations tend to go, oh, we should get solar panels, but avoiding and reducing energy use in the first place is the most important thing to do, and then look at replacing and then offsetting, which we are not a big fan of, to put it mildly, but there can be a place for that, for those unavoidable emissions. And there are some nice, meaningful and innovative approaches to that. And I think for heritage organizations in particular, the area around natural capital and what you can do through nature is really interesting and important. In terms of measuring, so what your greenhouse gas emissions are, some of the key framework is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which explains the different scope of emissions, scopes 1, 2 and 3. So basically scope 1 are the direct emissions from owned or operated assets, and most commonly for organizations in the heritage sector that will be burning natural gas on site, and company-owned vehicles or generators if you have them. Scope 2 is emissions from the energy you buy, but that is generated elsewhere, so purchased power and heat. And basically scope 3 is the emissions related to everything else, which are in your supply chain, for example, through your business travel, through investments, and through areas like food and drink, which is purchased and provided on site. When we're working with organizations, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is the key framework in terms of scoping and measurements of emissions. The governmental environmental reporting guidelines is another key reference, and for organizations, some of which will be in your group, the greening government commitments are also an important point of reference. And these were recently updated at the end of last year. And just to say that That new set of commitments also includes nature recovery and adaptation to climate change. Another important framework which you might have heard of and is something we work with sometimes is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. This is more for big corporates, but it is a useful framework in terms of the process, and it does provide some good, useful resources in terms of the kind of targets and levels of reduction organizations should be working towards. On the global level, the United Nations has two campaigns, the Race to Zero, which is around emissions reduction, and there are different ways and frameworks to sign up to be part of the Race to Zero, and then Race to Resilience, which is brand new, and Climate Heritage Network is one of the partners. And this is, as it says, about climate resilience and adaptation, so that we can actually not just survive and the consequences of climate change, but thrive. And then a couple of other kind of initiatives to mention within this net zero journey. I'm sure you've heard of Heritage Declares. There are a number of different declares, movements, culture declares, music declares, and Heritage Declares have a website and are doing some events and a set of commitments, 10 commitments, which can be a really useful framework for heritage organizations. And also I would say that's what's a really kind of positive development in the UK is what's happening on the local authority level, and some cities which are setting and counties which are setting really ambitious targets, and these are proving very useful frameworks for individual cultural organizations and heritage organizations who these strategies cover. And another framework I would just mention in terms of the net zero journey, which is, I think, a really, really useful guide, is Project Drawdown, and it is about the solutions which we need to implement. And I think this is a really lovely summary of, what's a climate strategy can look like in terms of the status quo, which is kind of, a bit more less ambitious, to what it looks like when it is really working towards the kind of change that we need to achieve. And I will also mention on natural capital, there's a lot of work in this area. The Natural Capital Coalition has provides a framework for understanding the value of natural capital and accounting for this, and then taking action. So it's a nice framework. It is quite involved, especially for smaller organizations who may not have a lot of resource, but it is definitely, especially for heritage organizations, a very important issue, an area to consider. And a lot of the organizations we work with, some of the heritage organizations we work with have been working to understand the value of the natural capital they have, to understand, for example, the importance of maintaining the carbon sinks which they have through their estates, for example. So if you're looking at really getting the measure of your emissions, first and foremost is starting with who you are, where you are, and what you do, and then looking across those different areas of where you can get information, and pulling that together to help develop your emissions and impact reporting. There usually, when organizations start pulling together the top line information, it's helpful to dig a little deeper So, and energy, this is just some examples around energy audits and energy monitoring to really dig down deeper, which will really help to better understand and identify actions and priorities. It's not only about the quantitative numbers, the CO2 metrics, but it's also really important to find out what people think, what do visitors think, what do your staff think. And we do a lot of work around staff surveys and also doing sector surveys, which we've done just recently for library sector. The numbers that you will get will give you your carbon footprint, and that will be made up of different sources of impact. But just very important to remember that a carbon footprint tells you your climate change impact. It does not tell you the whole story, so it's really important to look also behind those numbers of what the emissions are telling you, what lies behind that, how much waste, what's happening to it, what kinds of resources are you consuming, and also to understand what's happening and to track that change over time. I'm going to give you a little example from Arts Council England. So they have an environmental programme, which is the heart of what they do in terms of supporting the sector and investing in the sector. And the environmental programme has been going for 10 years and has achieved great things. And then last year they realised that they had to do a lot more in terms of their own impacts and actions as an arts council and an arm's length body of government. So we worked with them to help them understand. They've done the kind of basic reporting under greening government commitments, which they had to do anyway. But we helped them to develop that understanding. We did survey, interviews, workshops, we reviewed data, we looked at across their estate, 9 offices, and basically helped them to better understand their impacts. So you can see here in terms of energy use, paper, waste, water, in business travel, and we helped them to develop that carbon footprints based on offices and travel. And then we also looked at scope 3 emissions in terms of procurements to help them see based on their spend, which is 7.2 million. So you can see they've got quite a lot of purchasing power. So it's really important to understand that and to take more action on that. So they have defined a number of key commitments and more specific targets, short-term targets, and then commitments to defining a pathway to net zero in line with the UK's net zero targets by March 2024. And within that, they identified 6 priority areas around people, place, travel, technology, procurement and pension. It's challenging, certainly, for them to measure all of this, and it's not possible to put everything into numbers. Some of the things like travel and build office energy use, of course, but there are other areas where they can nonetheless do a lot, where it's trickier to put the impacts and progress into CO2 metrics. And then Suzanne also asked me to speak about some collaborative, collective approaches. So I'm just going to briefly mention a few. One of them is the Spotlight programme, which is a strand within the Arts Council England's environmental programme. And basically we knew that within the hundreds and hundreds of organisations Arts Council invest in, there is a group that generates the majority of the emissions through their energy use in buildings. So the Spotlight programme is for 30 organisations across 80 sites, some of which you can see on the slides. And basically it's been running for 3 years, and it's been quite a light touch approach, but it's about helping them to really understand their starting points, to set science-based targets, and then to look at pathways to achieving them. And the 3 key areas It doesn't sound like rocket science, but it's using energy as efficiently as possible. So reduce first, then electrifying buildings and moving away from natural gas to heat pumps, and then using green electricity where possible. So that's been, I think, one of the key things about that program is it's very much a peer-to-peer learning and sharing approach, and I think that's been one of the most valuable aspects of it. COVID has, of course, not helped, but I think there was a bit of a pause in it, and it's getting back on track now. Another collective approach which we've been slightly involved in is the Museums Development project, which is funded by Arts Council, and it brings together Manchester Museum, the Carbon Literacy Project, and Museums Development, and it's called Roots and Branches. And there are different strands to it. Developing carbon literacy for museums is one of the key strands, but Manchester Museum is also developing an environmental hub at the newly refurbished museum, and they're also creating a museum's climate action role, which is shared across the partners in the organisation. And then another really great approach, collective approach, we're seeing a lot emerging around place-based initiatives, and we've done in particular a lot of work in Manchester. What started out 11 years ago now as the Manchester Arts Sustainability Team and is now called GMAS because it's going across Greater Manchester. And this brings together all shapes and sizes of cultural and creative organisations on collective action and responses and engagement to the climate crisis. And the Manchester approach has also been shared across other cities, including Mantova, which is a UNESCO heritage site, and Šibenik in Croatia, which has, I think, two UNESCO heritage sites in the city. And basically Manchester shared its approach, collective approach, with these cities who have gone on to develop and do something similar themselves. And finally, on the place-based approaches, so Manchester inspired other cities in the UK to do something similar. So you've got Sail, which is in Leeds, and Shift, which is in Liverpool. And recently we've been working with the three networks to bring them together to learn about each other's models and to see how they could collaborate. So there's some really fantastic initiatives across those three networks. And within Manchester, the MASS network has worked very closely with Manchester City Council, and they have done a range of initiatives to support cultural action on climate within the city as well, which has been a really exciting initiative, especially over the last 2 years. So that is a bit of a whiz through on net zero. I did want to say that we are doing a conference in October in Birmingham. We Make Tomorrow, which we would love. You can find the link on our website, and it really is about bringing the community together to look at leadership going forward. So I hope that you will take a look, and it will be wonderful to have you join us. Sorry, Suzanne, I know I've gone way over time. Sorry.
Absolutely fascinating, Claire, and really, really useful. So many useful links and resources and things that I'll definitely share with the group, and hopefully we can share the slides afterwards. But this is exactly the kind of content that we need, just bringing all that kind of support, you know, that's already out there together and putting it in one space. So it's really, really useful. Thank you. Any questions for Claire over the next 5 minutes or so? Anybody? Go for it, Crispin. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. That was really interesting. I just wondered about, particularly as you guys started in the music industry, what are the sort of main proposals for global travel? Because obviously in the heritage sector, quite a lot of our activity is either directly or indirectly involved in in tourism, international tourism especially. And I just, other than offsetting and greater efficiency, I suppose, I just have no idea how international travel is going to be solved.
It's okay. We've got Jet Zero, the UK government's sustainable fuels policy. Sorry.
Is that to throw a spanner in the works at Heathrow? Is that the secret plan?
I don't know if you saw, but they snuck it out last week, exactly in the middle of, you know, all of this horrendous heat. That is not, it's not going to solve the problem. It's probably the biggest challenge. There are, I would say, in the music sector in particular, some really interesting initiatives. Equilibrium is a really nice initiative, which is about different approaches to understanding and compensating for international travel, to avoiding it. Also, of course, and there are some really interesting initiatives, and it is there are so many different initiatives and projects on international travel and touring. Nobody has the solution. There's some really radical thinking. There are some organizations who have decided not to tour. There's a lot of talk about slow travel, for example, but this is, I think, this has a climate justice element to it, because it can be seen, you know, first of all, for the islands, it's quite challenging. It's okay if you're touring around Europe or traveling around Europe where you have better train options, but it can be seen as quite exclusive for the global South countries, for artists, for example, in the global South, who feel that slow travel basically excludes them from their own artistic opportunities. So there's a lot of work and a lot of thinking going on around this. If you're interested, I would definitely look at the Equilibrium initiative from the music sector. But it is really challenging. And this is the bit, if you remember in one of the slides, is the control, influence, and can't control. And this is where you can do so much yourselves and you can raise awareness, but it's really putting the pressure on political leadership and transports services. But it is I would say, the biggest challenge. Sorry, I don't have any answers.
No, well, that's kind of what I thought. I didn't know what there was out there. I mean, I know slow travel is sort of increasing in popularity again. But yeah, it does seem like that's the real square we have to circle, or vice versa.
I mean, I would say, like, in terms of really radical thinking, one field of thinking, for example, is for some of the national organizations, let's say cultural organizations in the UK, is to focus on the national, to bring culture to people. And to look more at the virtual experience for international visitors. But you know, this is a fundamental radical change, which would take a lot of bravery. Yeah,
it's just a completely different business model, isn't it?
And I think, you know, ultimately, it's challenging. I mean, in our work. Yeah, okay, so you could say, just don't do anything, don't do any touring, don't do any culture, you know, but it's not about that. It's about doing the best that you can and putting pressure on to get solutions in the areas where you can't, really.